Hey, Mr. Usher here, doing another recording for our half credit class. So this one, as the dates will show us here, is going to basically cover the 28th and the 29th of April. So it's going to be, just to make sure I'm getting the right dates for you guys, that is going to be the 28th for my 8th credit class, and 8th period class, and the 29th for the 5th period class. So 28th for 8th, 29th for 5th. Otherwise, goodbye. Anyway, the subject for today is going to be the history and terminology of, wow, that was a poor execution on my part, the history and terminology of the psychology of prejudice. So kind of a long title. Basically, one of the subfields within social psychology is the psychology of prejudice, right? Basically, the study of how behaviors and mental processes contribute to some groups of people treating other groups of people in an unfair and negative way, right? So, we looked a little bit at the history and terminology of this, right? First part of that involved some reading, actually from a textbook of my own. This is the Psychology of Prejudice and Discrimination. This was actually a textbook that I used when I was in college. I took a class called The Psychology of Prejudice. It was a general overview of this topic. I'm really going to be covering this in 2 or 3 lessons, which really doesn't do justice to it, right? Because, as I said, I took a whole class on this. It was an entire semester. But yeah, I'm going to do the best that I can with the time that we have here. And I basically had some reading from this particular book, so you can get that essentially by opening up this PDF here. Now the copying, which was done with my smartphone, was not the best, but please try your best here to read along with me. Basically, we start here with historical views of ethnic groups. That's kind of the history part here. So basically what it kind of outlines in here is that views of different groups have changed dramatically based on historic events, right? So really recent example, or fairly recent example, was the fact that unfortunately in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, negative views against Muslim Americans skyrocketed, right? So they give a pretty clear example here, right? Let's see here. Negative reactions towards individuals from Middle Eastern countries increased after that terrible day. Human Rights Watch reported a 10-fold increase in the number of anti-Muslim hate crimes and dramatic increases in violence against mosques after 9/11. Mosques, for students who don't know, are basically places of worship for Muslim people, just like churches are for Christians, synagogues are for Jews. I'm failing to think of other houses of worship. My apologies to anybody else of any other faith. But yeah, it's a house of worship for Muslims. So unfortunately, mosques were attacked either very physically by damaging them or even trying to blow them up in some cases, or just with graffiti and other kinds of cowardly acts like that. The Gallup organization also reported that a majority of Americans polled agreed that there are too many immigrants from Arab countries, and that 60% of respondents favored reducing the number of Arabs granted admission. People also didn't want to live near Middle Easterners. This was even at a time when distrust for people from Mexico, from south of our border, was really high, and so even compared to distrust of Mexican immigrants, Middle Eastern immigrants was very, very high, right? Now compare that to historically. If you look at the early 1900s, Irish and Italian immigrants, right? I actually, for example, have a decent amount of Irish ancestry. My mother's mother definitely had a lot of Irish ancestry. Her surname was Gallagher, which was a pretty Irish name. My dad's mother also had a mixture of German and Irish ancestry. So yeah, a little bit of that, both of that on my sides of the family. And so yeah, when families like that came, from like the, roughly the 1880s through the 1920s, right? There was some genuine discrimination against both Irish Americans, Italian Americans, and other groups like Jewish Americans, which I also share ancestry with. The question then is, how is it that these groups were discriminated against then, but not now, right? And largely the answer is, well, race or racial categories are socially constructed. They're not real biological things about you or me. They're things that we socially construct, which means that enough people collectively agree upon them being true, and therefore they are effectively true, right? It talks about here how categories of white versus non-white are fluid. They change over time, right? Changed over time. In fact, we can see actually from this particular readout here, if you want to take a look at this, feel free to pause this and read a little bit more about it. You can pause it here. If you want to read more, you can pause it here. But basically what it says here is, if I read this particular smaller paragraph, it is important to bear in mind that race is a social category, not a biological one. For example, genetic studies find more differences within traditionally defined racial groups than between them, right? So they don't really mean a whole lot. People notice physiological differences between groups, such as skin color or the thickness of noses or lips, because such differences are superficial and do not, in fact, represent reliable ways to distinguish between groups of people. In statistical terms, the difference between races that do exist are trivial relative to genetic factors, such as blood groups, serum proteins, and enzymes that are common to all people. Steven Pinker, a world-renowned social psychologist, brilliant man, notes, quote, "The difference in skin color and hair that are so obvious when we look at people of other races are really a trick played on our intuition. Racial differences are largely adaptations to climate. Skin pigment was a sunscreen for the tropics. Eyelid folds were goggles for the tundra. The parts of the body that face the elements are also the parts of the face also the parts that face the eyes of other people, which fools them into thinking that racial differences run deeper than they really do." So we see something and assume that it's true. We might assume something because of my fluffy hair, or the fact that my eyesight isn't that good, which is why I wear these glasses, or, my size of my nose, shape of my ears, any number of these things. That doesn't really say much about my biology. So race, as we call it, race, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, what have you, these are things that have a lot of social relevance, right? They mean a lot in society, whether we like it or not. But biologically, they mean next to nothing, right? Anyway, moving on here, we have different theories of prejudice and discrimination that I wanted to go over. I'm just going to go over this chart very quickly here. Basically, this is a history of how Americans, and really Western culture more broadly, saw the concept of race and racial prejudice over the course of the 20th century, right? So if you look at prior to the 1920s, there was something that we call scientific racism, right? So scientific racism sounds like a really backwards and ugly thing, because it was. Basically, the idea was that we could use science to prove that certain races were inferior, right? One of the classic and bogus experiments that was done during this time was by a scientist who decided he would collect a bunch of skulls from different human beings from different parts of the world and fill them with wood ash, right? So he would just burn a bunch of wood, and he would fill the skulls with ash. And he was like, these European skulls, they hold so much more ash than these other skulls. And, that doesn't really prove much of anything, because to bring some neurology information on you, the intraspecies differences between brain size tell you relatively little about intelligence, as opposed to interspecies differences, right? Yes, it matters that the size of our brain is different than the size of a chimpanzee's brain. But just because my brain might be slightly larger or slightly smaller than yours doesn't mean that I'm necessarily more intelligent than you. So A, there's that, and B, and probably more importantly, he faked data. He just straight up faked the data. So if he got, say, too much ash in a African skull or too little ash in a European skull, he'd be like, oh, look at this. He'd fake it. It was a fake. So there was that period. And then very, very gradually, as we see here, going through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, we started to question that. Freud, in a weird way, is kind of credited for that, because his psychodynamic approach caused us to question that. At first we were like, well, these are basically like irrational and unjustified attitudes that maybe come from kind of impulsive reactions that we have because we're not thinking rationally, because our id is kind of taking over. Then, it kind of jumped to this unconscious defense approach, like maybe we're afraid of something, and, instead of kind of speaking that out loud, we kind of formed these prejudices and these biased attitudes. Then it kind of jumped into full-on pathology. We assumed that racist people were pathologically ill. This is very common right after the Holocaust, because we're like, well, how did this happen? How did we end up killing millions and millions of people, right, in this terrible thing? How could, this small group of humans do this to this much larger group of humans? And initially the reaction was, well, they're all mentally ill, which sounds appealing, but is probably too simple. In the 60s, as the civil rights movement was evolving, it became more about basically social norms that we had taught children over the long periods of time that, yeah, you know, certain groups should be considered inferior, certain groups should be considered on top. That's the normal thing. If you don't listen to what we say, you know, that's how it works. So there were social norms, and that is definitely true. It's still a major part of how we understand the psychology of prejudice. Things got a little more complicated as things went on, right? You know, understanding broader social structures, not just in terms of, you know, laws that were put in place to discriminate against people, but also broader structures baked into, you know, economics, baked into school, baked into religion, that might explain things. And then there's the more contemporary approach that began in the 1980s, and that combines cognitive and evolutionary psychology, basically arguing that, for better or for worse, in our early human environment, we developed a lot of cognitive biases or mental shortcuts that essentially said, like, okay, how do you decide who is safe and who is dangerous, right? And many of these things probably were useful for us surviving early on, but now take the form of prejudice, discrimination, stereotyping, which is bad. It's morally wrong, right? So these things were given to us kind of through evolution, and we think this way, kind of whether we want to or not. But now we have to decide, what do we do? And that actually leads us to a different thing here. So, go full screen on you for a second. Welcome to my magical whiteboard here. This is a whiteboard here in my own home. I know it's really fancy, right? So, you'll see 3 areas here. Remember that we define psychology as the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So, the B stands for behavior, the F stands for feelings, the T stands for thoughts. So prejudice, right, is fundamentally a feeling, right? It's a gut reaction to a person that is a part of a group or perceived to be part of a group. Sometimes we incorrectly perceive people to be part of a group, right? Just because somebody's wearing a turban, for example, does not mean they're a Muslim or a member of any religion for that matter. So prejudice is fundamentally a feeling. It's a gut reaction, typically a negative reaction. A stereotype is a thought. It's a simplistic and overly rigid thought. Basically, it says that, like, yeah, you know, this group of people has this trait, I think they have this trait, and therefore I'm going to assume that every member of this group has this trait no matter what. And any kind of divergence from that, anybody who's different from that, they're a weirdo, they're an outlier, they're, you know, that's on them. It's not a problem with how I'm thinking, it's a problem with them, right? So these two things bounce off of each other, thoughts affecting feelings, feelings affecting thoughts. But the big daddy is discrimination, because that's the behavior. You cannot have discrimination unless people engage in actual behavior, right? That doesn't mean these other two things are okay. They are not. But this is the one that's actual behavior. This is where you treat a person differently based on the fact that they are in a different group or perceived to be in a different group, whether you do it directly or indirectly, right? Much discrimination is kind of indirect or implicit. But yeah, that's how these 3 fit together. It's very important that you guys remember this one, so feel free to pause the video here if you need to. Anyway, with the time remaining, let me get back to what we have left here. So, basically the last activity looked at something called the implicit association test. That actually has a link. Go back to classwork. There's a link right here. The implicit association test is a common, albeit somewhat controversial tool used in the psychology of prejudice. I don't know where the link went. That was strange. But the implicit association test is commonly used in social psychology, and particularly in the psychology of prejudice, because it allows us to see how people match up different ideas and words to different social groups, right? To be clear, it doesn't tell you that you are racist or sexist or Islamophobic or whatever. It just kind of shows what your immediate reaction is, what kind of prejudice you might form, or what kind of stereotypes you might hold. It doesn't say that you're going to discriminate necessarily, because that is a choice that you have. Discrimination is a choice, it's an action that we take, and it's something we can stop ourselves from doing if we really want to, right? So that's the thing I want to enforce. I think it's a really great and important ethical point. But anyway, I will make sure the link for that is up. My time is almost about out here, so I want to just end with that. There is a ticket out the door for this, so please check that out. Otherwise, have any questions, please ask me. Have a good one, guys.